Gary, for that, setting things up. We do continue to have challenges in engineering education, don't we? I'd also like to thank the student division, and particularly the leadership in the student division. They are doing amazing things, and the co-sponsors for this talk, and so I think all of us really deserve to recognize the student division apparently has 400 to 500 members now, and there were about 140 people at the dinner on Monday night. So that is just phenomenal growth, and I think very comforting to for the rest of us oldsters in the audience. The talk today, the students challenged us to inspire change agents, and that's a really sobering thing to do. And what I'm going to do is do that through the story of all of us in the room that we have collected at the Center for Engineering, Learning, and Teaching through an NSF project where we had graduate students interview pioneers in the field. One of the most inspiring and engaging things I've been involved in my history in the department. What department am I in? In the field. I'm also really, really happy just to be here. I don't know if you've heard this, but I had my retina reattached on May 23rd. And that's a little bit of an involved surgery. And I want to say this, I want to say if you remember anything from this talk today, that is, if you see flashes, if you get floaters all of a sudden, go immediately to the eye doctor. If you can't get to the eye doctor, go to the ER. Because I'm going to get my sight back eventually, and it didn't have to turn out that way. So I feel very, very fortunate. It also means that if you are raising a hand on this side of the room, jumping up and down won't help, because you're going to have to yell something, because I can't see out of this side. And if I start wandering around, please let me know if I get close to the edge. I think if you see me talk before, you've never seen me tethered to a podium, but I'm kind of hanging on here. So that's the reason why. The other thing I wanted to say, sort of FYI, is that the story is really grounded in your experience. So I'd like you to take a moment and think about your experience in engineering education. So Gary outlined one of our new challenges, and the construction of the talk was, that was about 20 minutes, and I'm supposed to talk for about 45, 50 minutes about what the conversations are. And so what I need to do is make sure that there are 45 actual minutes instead of 45 Cindy minutes, if you know what I mean. So if someone on this side of the room could let me know when 35 actual minutes have transpired, then we can compare them to the Cindy minutes and readjust. So, engineering educators. How many of you consider yourself an engineering educator? Yes, we are among friends. One of the things that happened after my eye surgery was you actually are not allowed to fly until they put this gas bubble in your eye, and you can't be elevated too high until the gas bubble is absorbed into your system. And you also have to stay still. So as I stayed still in one position for 10 days, I had a lot of time to reflect. And it is actually amazing what you can see when you can't see. But one of those things was I'm trying to calculate. I'm like, oh no, distinguished lecture student group, you can't pull out. So I'm going, okay, when is the bubble going to dissolve? So I'm doing modeling, right? I'm trying to make, estimates of how big the bubble is, and what's the shape of the curve, and when will it cross zero, and will that happen in time for me to get on a plane? And one of the things that I was doing after doing the approximate modeling that we all do as engineers is I started to go, okay, well, what about the physical model? What about, the pressure of the gas, and how might it actually absorb? And I remembered the ideal gas law. I took thermodynamics in 1977. So there are P equals nRT. Who could forget that? So how many of you remembered the ideal gas law? Right, okay, you are all engineers. And you raised your hand to be engineering educators, so this is the identity crisis that we have, right? Okay, am I an engineer? Am I an educator? Am I an engineering educator? What the heck is that? So that's what we're going to talk about this morning. These are issues that are actually really important if we want to inspire change agents and for us to continue to be change agents. And so I'll get into some of the stories that we've been learning from the pioneers in the field through the voices of the people who are just entering the field now. And it's very inspiring. First, quick jaunt to my own personal version of the story. My first paper in 1992 was co-authored with Indira Nair, who is, I think, in the audience somewhere. And we wrote a paper called Constructivism, Appropriate for Engineering Education? So, have we answered that question yet? Maybe? If you've encountered any of my work in the literature, it probably was my design process work. I don't ever get very far from the timeline design process representations that are my sort of alter ego. I actually, the other day, I thought maybe I should make a pair of earrings from the timelines, right? Because then they would be completely accessible and I could say, problem scoping is important. Remember to gather information throughout the entire design process. Or the ideal project envelope, you know, design can have a shape. Or you may have seen some of the work that the Cal team is doing on context. Or what about CAEE? So raise your hand if you know about CAEE. Not too bad. Okay, those of you who didn't raise your hand, be sure to ask somebody who raised their hand at the end of the session about the awesome work of over 100 scholars distributed across the country. And CAE is still #1 on the Google search. You know, might have something to do with the 10 or 20 searches I do every night. Once a center director, always a center director. And you may actually have heard we have a very exciting new venture funded by the Helmsley Charitable Trust, building on Jennifer Turn's scholarship on reflection in engineering education. And so stay tuned for that. So that's my personal journey. I was really lucky to have support from my home institution with a very supportive department chair and associate dean, Harvey Wolf and Larry Schumann. And I don't know, Larry might be here, you might have seen him sometime at the conference. Really supportive. But it was actually through the community that I found here at ASEE, and particularly ERM, but really the whole distributed ASEE community, that I found motivation and enthusiasm, and I sort of would get charged up every time I would come to an ASEE or an FIE and then go back home and, you know, keep on working and really get some motivation from my colleagues at ASEE. And I remember contrasting that community with communities from other conferences that I would go to, and somebody described the community here in a way that I've always remembered and tried to emulate, and that is when you're having a conversation here at ASEE, people look you in the eye, not over your shoulder to whoever else is more important coming down the hallway. And I think that's an important element. For me, there's only one eye at the moment, so it's only half a person talking to you, but we'll work on that maybe by next year. So what we're talking about today is not just my version of this journey, but everybody in the room has their version of a personal journey, right? And it comes from different motivations, different contexts, different areas of investigation, many, many different pathways. And every single story is really unique. And those stories are happening in a really rapidly growing community. And one of the things I'd like you to do, so you already thought about your own pathway. So I'd like you to take a moment now and add 2 things to that personal story. What's the approximate year that you entered the community? Okay, it's not actually that easy of a question to answer. Okay, and what would you think of your biggest challenge? entering the community or on your campus or with your work. Okay, so use those two things as part of your anchor going forward in the work today. And so what I'll be doing is setting a bit more of the stage, talking about insights from some of the pioneers that were engaged in our study, insights from the graduate students, and then talk with Gary about sort of how are we looking forward here. And I said rapidly growing community. This is a graphic that's just a representation that indicates we have had lots of new national organizations, lots of new organizations that have started out on campuses. People are writing a lot more papers in conferences and journals, and we even have new journals that have been emerging. And so this is a sample of activity from the US just to demonstrate that yes, we are definitely a growing community. If our student division has 400 or 500 members, I mean, how cool is that? So there we go. We also are a community that, I'm really proud of this, we have been thoughtful about the fact that we're rapidly growing, right? I mean, we have been doing things like, and I'm going to, at the risk of not mentioning every single project that we've been working on, I just want to demonstrate the scope. So across the years, as we have been really growing, we have been engaging in, okay, small notes, one eye, little teeny acronyms. NETI, Project 2020, CCSSIEE, or the Mississippi Report, as it's affectionately known, CAEE, ISEE, SEED, APS, REE, of course, ASEE, ERM, right? CASEE, changing the conversation, mapping the field, looking at the colloquies, REES, etc. There's a decoder ring that you can pick up as you leave after the talk today. And so the intent of that was to say, as a community, we've known we've been growing fast, and we've been thinking about how we've been doing the growing and trying to be thoughtful as we've been doing the growing. We also have had a lot of authors who have been looking at this issue very seriously, and they're on the posted set of slides that we'll put, there will be a sample of kinds of papers to look at, but I would encourage you to look at, for example, Robin Adams' work on discourse communities. And we're not just one community. We really are made up of several kinds of communities engaging in really diverse discourse. Other lenses by Mara Borrego and Krishna Bhanavan, and so lots of things that we can look at to say what has been the history of our field. So why did we actually want to add to that? We've been thoughtful. We're having people write about it. And so we have this NSF grant, but I want to let you know the backstory. And the backstory starts with, well, it all began with Charlie. Those of you whose entry year was 80 or 90s, you might actually also be able to have some sort of long story that's thread with, it all began with Charlie. So I don't know if Charlie Okamoto is here. Charlie, how about if you stand up for a second? We need to introduce you to the crew that's here today. So Charlie I met in 1992 from IUPUI, so we are in his hometown right now. And every year, Conversations with Charlie is one of the reasons why I wanted to go to ASEE and FIE. And he was part of the community that would say, how are you doing? What are you working on? I'm doing this in my classroom. You know, other people who were part of that wonderful community too. And it was just fabulous. I would go back energized. But I came to the ASEE conference in 2006, and Charlie told me he was retiring. I was like, what? You didn't ask me if you could do that? I was really offended. You know how you can't remember what city you're in, but you remember the hotel, right? You know, so the escalator was over here, the carpet was big flowers, and Charlie's telling me he's retiring. And so for a while, I was really sad for me. And then I started to go, oh my gosh, I'm really sad for the community. Because, you know, people joining the community after 2006 aren't going to know Charlie and aren't going to get energized by Charlie at every ASEE and FIE, and they'll go back and, oh no. So then I started to be really sad for everyone. And I was going, okay, what can we do about this? If you think about it from a broader perspective, and all of us as individuals in a larger community, there's somebody much more profound than I who has addressed this issue. And Robert Kennedy said in one of his many amazing speeches, "Few will have the greatness to bend history, but each of us can work to change a small portion of the events, and in the total of all those acts will be written the history of this generation." And for me, that symbolizes the fact that we aren't just one big group, that we're individuals that are also members of this big group and this big community. And so the urgency of making sure other people new to the community know Charlie's story became greater for me. However, it was 2006, and it was in the middle of CAEE, and I wasn't adding anything else to my plate. Remember now how many people have heard of CAEE? Oh, Center for Advancement in Engineering Education, good. Okay, so as we're progressing with that, some of you may not be surprised that my office is comprised of a set of piles and books and mementos and quotes and sort of, it's a messy office. You know, I think of it as my milieu. And so the thought of Charlie and Charlie's story was stirred up with some of the things that I keep around, like the quote from Kermit, our friend, "It's not easy being green." Or Achebe, "Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always belong to the hunter." I have that one right underneath my computer. That's really, really important to me. Another one by Pasteur, "Chance favors the prepared mind." And then, you know, perhaps my favorite philosopher, my younger daughter, one time when we were at a playground, she was about 4 and she was going to ride her bicycle, and I noticed that she was over at the jungle gym, and I said, "Toby, I thought you were going to ride your bicycle." And she said, "Oh, I changed my mind." And then she paused for a moment and she said, "No, my mind changed me." Whoa. So what does that mean for us? Okay, so Kermit the Frog, "Not easy being green." Well, we're sort of green, aren't we? And we can be green here together, but sometimes it's hard to be green when we go back home. And histories that Achebe is talking about, all histories are written through somebody's lens. There's a filter by definition. And so individual stories in personal voices are also important. And Pasteur, the prepared mind, how do we as a community know in our collective prepared mind what it is that we're drawing from in our past history? And then what do I, Toby's insight, what do I have in my own mind? What do I choose to put in my own mind so I can make choices going forward? So, from that, and from my awesome colleagues at KELT, Jennifer Turns, also faculty in Human-Centered Design and Engineering, Ken Yasuhara, research scientist, Jim Borgford-Parnell, Associate Director of KELT, Brooke Sattler, who recently got her PhD from Human-Centered Design and Engineering, working with Jennifer, in a deep dive into self-authorship. And so you might want to talk with her about that really compelling work after the talk. Well, we said, okay, personal stories, what could we add to what's out there? We started to do some pilots. Brooke interviewed John Haywood in 2010. You always learn amazing things talking to John Haywood. And we went, okay, yeah, we can learn some more. So we did a larger pilot the next year. Brooke rallied 16 graduate students, and there's Brooke over there, rallied 16 graduate students, and we interviewed 16 pioneers in the field, and then had gatherings, and Alan funded this. Well, Alan came to these gatherings, and they were gatherings between the graduate students and the pioneers, and they were so motivating and really quite magical, because the connection that was made across generations was something that was tangible, and not only was real information exchanged, but also mentoring and motivation. And so we wrote a proposal to NSF that we got funded, and that was when Alan was project officer there. And so that is where we the spur that got us to take these 40 stories of pioneers from grad students. The goals are to connect across generations, to catalyze the new engineering education scholar committee, and to also gain insights from the pioneers that are for the broader community. So we will be posting profiles of all the pioneer interviews on the web sometime in the fall. We hope this year, fall, by the way. You know how time goes. Those Cindy minutes really go at a really different time scale. And then Cheryl Allendorfer, part of our project team, is analyzing the pioneer experiences, and so we'll be writing papers about those. And so, let's see. What I'd like to do now is, remember your entry year? Raise your hand if your entry year was in the 50s. Okay. The 60s. Okay. Keep it up. Keep your hand up if it's okay. The 70s. All right. The 80s. All right. The 90s. That's me in there. The 2000 to 2005. Keep your hands up, everybody. Okay. So look around and see those hands. Okay. So now hands down. If you are somebody who entered the field between 2005 and 2010, please stand up. All right. And if you entered from 2010 till now, also stand up. All right. So we just demonstrated, stay standing, we just demonstrated the pioneers in the room and the next generation in the room. So I'd like you to reach over and shake the hand of the closest individual who is either standing or sitting. So introduce yourself. We are now having a conversation. I knew that was going to be dangerous. And we just demonstrated how amazing the conversations were, because this is a room full of pioneers and a room full of next generation scholars. And so what we did next in our project was, I have to say, the most difficult part of the whole project, because you saw how many pioneers there were. Well, we had to figure out with our limited resources how we could interview just a small subset. So we sought nominations from all kinds of places, like ASEE, ERM, and places you see up here. Over 30 people nominated, 93 individuals, and then with 47 final pioneers who were interviewed. And then the choice was made through a complex process, and all I can say is, thank goodness for advisory boards. Oh. Also wanted to mention additional parts of our team, Cheryl Allendorfer and Dennis Mund, and then amazing set of people on our advisory board with the distributed areas of expertise. So, here we go. Here's the diverse crew of pioneers. And the slides that we will post will have the names of all the pioneers. And at the end of the session, we will have a, where's Waldo? Go. Okay, see you. The approximate entry year for the pioneers, 18 in the 80s, 22 in the 90s, small tails on either side of that distribution. What did we ask them? How did you get involved? Who or what are your influences? What kind of challenges did you face? How did you overcome them? Your contributions and impact, what kinds of lessons did you learn, and any advice for new graduate students. And you can imagine, just you saw those small conversations. We heard a lot. But what I'm going to do today is focus on some of the challenges and some of the strategies to overcome the challenges. And so, as a thought experiment, I would like you to pretend like your entry year was the 80s. If your entry year actually was the 80s, pretend to be yourself. Might be kind of hard there, it's early. So pretend like your entry year was the 80s. And think about what kind of challenge you might face. Okay, someone want to volunteer a type of challenge?
Difficult sharing teaching resources.
Difficult sharing teaching resources. Okay, others?
Very manual information gathering.
Pardon?
Information gathering was very manual and very paper.
Information gathering, very manual, yeah.
Finding somebody to collaborate with.
Charlie, finding somebody to collaborate with. One more, Leah.
Your colleagues don't think it's a respectable field.
What do you mean? Really? Leah said, your colleagues don't think it's a respectable field. Yes. Well, what do we find when we actually look at what the pioneers told our graduate student interviewers? What we did, what Cheryl Allendorfer did, amazing collaborator, looked at did a preliminary analysis of the pilot interviews that we had, and came up with some emergent themes that she used as a lens to do an initial reading of 38 of the pioneer transcripts, and then we chose some representative quotes for each theme. Two things I want to note here. I didn't tell you the timing. All of these interviews took place from January, the whole process from January, and the process just ended on Sunday. So the interviews took place in March. So all of this is hot off the press and really emergent. And I also want to say that I was asking pioneers for their permission to use quotes here, and everybody said, yes, fabulous, and didn't have room to put all of them in the talk, so the other ones will be on the version that is posted when we post it in fall of next year. So this is the subset. Okay. Where's Waldo? Okay, here we go. A short history of engineering education by Rich Felder. A broad community of practice started to develop as a result of the engineering education coalitions, and engineering educators began looking seriously at questions about the cultures of engineering, engineering education, and engineering education research in a way that had never been done before. Ron Miller added to that, saying, a discipline has emerged. It's grown up from a group of engineers goofing around to the beginnings of a formal discipline with a very large interdisciplinary group of relative professionals. I don't know what Ron means by relative professionals. I'll let you call him and ask, okay? Who try to tackle really tough, complicated engineering education-related questions, which is very exciting. Looking back on it, boy, we've come a long way in 30 years. And I think looking around the room, I would have to agree with Ron. Okay, so next, the challenges. You can sort of group these challenges into two large groupings. Challenges for the field, like it's difficult to bring about change, areas not seen as valid. Leah, what can I say? Access to resources, already mentioned as well, perceived prestige, and then sort of more at an individual level, issues relating to gender and feeling alone. Charlie, you really weren't alone, you just felt alone. Obviously, all of these things were related to each other, and now what we're going to do is dive into some examples of the challenges. So how am I doing on the Cindy minutes here? I've got 9 left, row. Oh, wait, 9 to 35? Oh, okay. Okay, because we really need to talk about our challenges, right? This is a group therapy. So, challenges difficult to bring about change. So Susan Metz is saying, generally people think change in engineering education is good, but operationalizing those new ideas so they really take hold, institutionalizing them across an engineering school or college of science throughout a university, that's the hard part. And then Carl says, it's looking like it's taking 20 to 30 years to get an idea from the well-developed research into undergraduate practice. So then you go actually to institutionalization, and we're in real trouble. Never mind. That was used. Okay, thank you. So what's next? Another one of the challenges, difficult to bring about change. So John Prados, I don't know if he's in the audience. Oh yes, there's John back there. So John is a straight talker. So the biggest challenge in bringing about academic change is the academic culture, by far. The greatest number of engineering graduates come from research-intensive institutions, like Gary was just talking about, right? With an academic culture that values disciplinary research far above other activities, including educational innovation. Within such a culture, if one wishes to innovate in engineering education, they must take it out of their hide. What do you think, John? It's true. Or I don't know. What do you think? Is it true?
What does take it out of their hide mean?
Okay, John. Do you want to elaborate? Yeah, so John's in the back of the room. So the question is, what does it mean to take it out of your hide?
I think that pretty much says it all.
It means you need to take it on, and you need to own it, and people aren't going to help you. You know, it sometimes means you're on your own, and you just have to stick with it because you believe it's important. Is that what it means, John? Okay. Next challenge. The area is not seen as valid. So, Leah, Carl agrees with you. In the early days, it wasn't traditional engineering research. There was a lot of disdain for this kind of work because for some faculty it's pretty threatening. It's about studying ourselves, and they didn't think it was worthwhile. And then moving on to some insights from Karen Watson. We also, as a community, didn't have access to the same kind of resources that our colleagues did in traditional engineering fields. So in the time frame when she got involved, there weren't the same publishing outlets. There weren't a lot of grant dollars that you could get. You didn't have PhD students who were studying and helping you to publish. So not only were you starting a new field, but you actually were starting that field without having access to the same resources that your colleagues in the other disciplines were. So that really added to the challenge. And this is my own side parenthetical remark, but I really think that that is one of the big, huge contributions of the engineering education coalitions, because we had access, the community had access to some of the same kinds of resources that our colleagues did in the technical disciplines, and we could really start the ball rolling a little bit faster. Karen continued with talking about the perceived prestige and framing that in terms of acceptance rate at conferences. So even the scrutiny of conferences, some of the technical conferences that she would go to had a 10 to 15% acceptance rate, but the ASEE acceptance rate for papers and proposals was more like 90%. So if there's a high acceptance rate, then clearly it's not prestigious. What do you think? Yeah, okay. Wait a minute. Let's pause before we get to gender. Are you ready? Here we go. So Lenny Morrell says, another challenge I had was about being a woman in a male-dominated society and profession. I always thought I had to give more than my male colleagues. So there was a chuckle from the front here. So you can just think internally, do I relate to that? Does that describe my situation? Well, I don't think many of you would actually be able to say you had the same experience as Mary Anderson Rowland in this second quote. In those days, when she entered the field, if you had to give an exam, you took it to the copy department. I remember that, actually. I started learning to program on punch cards. You know, copy, you're in Xerox, right? Here's Mary right here. So what happened to Mary is astounding. During the first semester when she was teaching, I go back to her words, I went to go pick up my exam, And they wouldn't give it to me because they knew there were no women faculty in engineering, and they thought that I was a student trying to steal the test. I had to go to the dean's secretary and get a note that said, Dr. Anderson teaches for us and she may pick up her exams. Imagine living with that experience. Here's one that's much more common, I think, that we can relate to. And that is, I'll just extract from here. Many times when there's only a few women in class or just one woman in a group, the teacher does not call on the female student, not letting her say anything, and didn't think that what she had to say would be credible at all. So that might be an experience that half the audience might relate to as well. And then there's another thing that shows up in the interviews, and that is, sometimes once we're allowed to speak, once we are called on, or we talk anyway, some of you might have the experience where you say something, come up with an idea, publish something, whatever it is, and then life goes by. And then a male colleague may say the same thing. And then everyone goes, oh, that's interesting. And you're going, what? What just happened there? So internally you can say, has that happened to you or not? I can say I was reading an article a few years ago where Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that she experienced the same thing. I don't find that a very comforting thought. But there you go, part of the challenges of this community. And then one of the challenges that Charlie talked about that I think many of us also experienced, both Stephanie Adams and Denny Davis talked about this, was Stephanie saying, I think the challenge was, I was one person by myself working in this area that nobody really understood, and I think there were questions about the importance, the rigor, the relevancy of that. Once my first 2 NSF grants came, then I became legitimate. Really important there. That's sort of one of the strategies of dealing with the challenges. And Denny said, another barrier, I think, is being alone. Trying to do things, and a way to overcome that was collaborating with people at other institutions in order to get a critical mass and get the expertise needed in order to build a team and move the work ahead. And I think Denny was a real role model in the work that he did with design from colleagues from many different institutions. So, there we go, talking about some of the challenges. Now, what are some of the strategies that emerged from the interviews? So they cluster in these areas. Get funding, Dollars means legitimacy in engineering. We just know that. So getting funding really helps. Be persistent. So that was another message that came through. Just own your passion. Own your ideas. Be persistent. I almost said, keep knocking your head against the wall. I don't mean that. Be persistent. Some people said keep up your technical research so that you're doing both. Personal choice there. Lots of different advice on when and what to do about promotion and tenure challenges. So we had people saying, wait till you're tenured, okay? Then who cares what you do, right? Go to a school where the work counts, okay? If you can find one. You were supposed to laugh there. There are schools where it counts. And just do it anyway. Do it, figure out what your challenges are, figure out how to navigate them. And then finding community and collaborators was, I think, one of the biggest messages that came out. So on your own campus, across campus, at a national community. And so I wanted to just end this section of challenges with, almost end this section, with the words of Charlie. I used to go to ASEE and FIE every year, and that was a really big source of energy to keep going. There was a lot of emotional support, going to those conferences. Many of us came from universities where there was just one or two of us working in engineering education. And we used to go to conferences to get this feedback, the emotional support, because you couldn't get it on your own campus. So, Charlie, I think in 2006 you had no idea, but I made a silent promise to you that I would make sure that your story got out and heard by people. And so I'm really glad that actually we were able to do that and that this whole room was able to hear your story. Very cool. Another big theme was represented by this quote, and that is, one thing is that it's important that those of us who've been involved in engineering education be available to those who are coming along. I think the sense of community is really important. And so that is something that we've been able to contribute to through this project as well. And so those of you in the next generation, just want you to know that those of us who are oldsters and going to be retiring sometime really do value this and really value making connections with you and talking with you about your insights and your efforts and those kinds of things. And so that leads us to the graduate student interviewers. Next, we will be talking about and looking at some of the insights that the graduate students themselves had while they were going through the process. So here we have also a little bit of the stats of how we identified the interviewers. We worked with we asked the 16 initial pilot project interviewers if they wanted to continue, and 8 of them did. They're all now graduated and in faculty positions and postdocs, but still we were happy that they continued with the project. For shorthand, you've noticed I'm calling them graduate students. Everybody was a graduate student when they entered the project, and so that's how I'll be referring to the full set of interviewers. Then we also found 32 new graduate students from 42 applicants, so we had an application process for that part. And here is the crew of interviewers. Now, pick a graduate student. Let's go back to the pioneers. Graduate student? No. Okay, no. That's not going to work. Amazing set of very energetic, insightful students. We had the last part of the project at a workshop on Sunday, and it was one of the most meaningful experiences I've had in engineering education. Actually, I'd like to, if you were an interviewer in this project, can you please stand up? Pioneer in this project, please stand up. One of the people interviewed. Okay. Awesome. Really, and oh, by the way, those people who stood up, Ken wants to get a real photo of you last night. He says my photography credentials are nowhere, and so after the session, if you could just hang out for a few minutes and get something done by a professional. Okay, so what did they do? This was a project, like I said, it went from January till Sunday, so all of this is really emergent. The students participated in 5 distributed workshops covering topics like interviewing and engaging in qualitative data analysis, data collection and analysis, authoring a profile. All the interviews were done remotely. The students transcribed their own interviews, quite a learning experience. And really engaged in everything from learning a research method to producing a profile. So it was really amazing. And through that set of workshops, the students gave reflective feedback for all of the experiences. And they were asked, what might have surprised you? What are you excited about? What might have frustrated you? Nothing, of course. And were there any aha moments that you had? And so what I'm going to do in the next several slides is just to discuss some of the feedback that we got from the students throughout the process. And their feedback groups into a couple of areas. One is how pioneers were making an impact, so insights about the pioneers themselves. And then the students coming to understand the system of engineering education through the pioneer experiences. And so seeing some of the pioneers as unsung heroes, seeing the diverse interests and actions of the pioneers, and also themselves looking forward. So, in the words of the students, an aha moment for one of the students was when they said, well, I really liked, and this is about the pioneer making an impact, I really liked that my pioneer said something about feeling like he was more of an explorer than a pioneer. When he was doing this research, he didn't even know what to expect because so little had been done. Pioneers know some of what's out there, but are the first to inhabit the new place, comparing himself more to an explorer like Lewis and Clark over the settlers of the West. And I thought that was really profound insight, but we weren't going to rename the project. Okay, another student was surprised and said, I was really surprised to hear things like active learning were new innovations when my pioneer got started. Now they're so mainstream that thinking of them as an innovation is surprising, but I guess back then they were new and different. So, the next time you see Carl Smith, you have to tell him that his work is done. And remember, he's the one who said it'll take 20 or 30 years to actually get something from research into the classroom. There you have it. I thought that was brilliant. Okay, another aha moment for one of the student interviewers, another moment when they were excited was the idea that some, or maybe most of the pioneers may be unsung heroes in engineering education. And they were really excited to understand and help communicate a story that may not have had other means to get out and be heard. And thinking that those stories will really enhance the historical perspective and insights of our field. And so that's really great because that, we were trying to do what Achebe is saying, we need to do and give voices to individual members from our past. Another observation was one student said, and several actually said something similar, I'm surprised to hear all of the different career paths that some of our pioneers took. It'll be interesting to see what commonalities we can find with so many different people we are interviewing. So, wow, lots of different pathways, lots of different things came out in the interviews, but we really did. Cheryl is seeing themes that emerge from looking at the interviews. And in the workshop on Sunday, we had the students do a clustering exercise with putting challenges on Post-it notes and then actually organizing them into clusters, and basically the clusters that they generated replicated the themes that Cheryl found in the interviews. So it's always good to actually have your research triangulated. And then looking forward, and the students looking at sort of what might be ahead for them, had a couple of aha moments. And that was, one said, engineering education and disciplinary education generally faces a monumental challenge of maintaining strong dialogue between researchers and practitioners. I think this is always going to be a challenge, right? That's the definition of research. We're pushing new frontiers. And then bringing it into practice is a problem for all fields, and it's certainly one that we experience. And then another aha moment is, I think, really hopeful that our jobs are incredibly flexible with respect to opportunities that arise. And collaborations can lead to life-changing roles and career focus. And I would like to add, they also lead to life-changing friendships and mentorships and individual connections. And that's really what the ASEE and ERM and FIE communities have meant to me. Looking at and reflecting on the experience, we had some feedback from the students, and I'll put up one anonymous feedback from the workshop on Sunday. And so one of the students said, "This was such a great opportunity to learn about a research field of which I consider myself a member, and a great experience for thinking about my career trajectory. Now that I have a better understanding of the groundwork associated with this field, I feel like I have a better understanding of the bodies of work associated with this field and where I can advance frontiers of this body of knowledge." So it's really incredible that not only was mentoring going on between the pioneers and the interviewers, but a lot of knowledge is transferred about what is there, where are some of the next places that we can push on the boundaries. And so that, I think, is really one of the benefits of this project. A couple of other comments from talking with some of the pioneers is that one said, what was really amazing about the project was the comprehensive nature. So this individual learned a new research methodology, learned a technology, really connected across generations, and then also connected within the generations. So each of the grad student interviewers meeting the other grad students from distributed institutions all across the country also made a cohort of people who know each other. And another one mentioned that it was really helpful to have the connection with the pioneer, have an entree of a conversation that was meaningful, right? It's hard if you don't know somebody to introduce yourself and to say anything besides, "So, what are you working on?" Or, "How's the weather? We might get a thunderstorm," right? But they had an assignment, and the pioneers knew it, and they went immediately to a very deep and meaningful conversation. So having an entree to have that conversation was a really helpful thing that was very much appreciated by the graduate students. And then the pioneers also appreciated the opportunity because many were able to look back and reflect, and there's this phenomenon of, we all sort of justify our pathway, right? And sometimes it's helpful to have somebody else ask you, and then you can look back and say, "Oh, there was a coherent thread," or at least make one up, right? The pioneers also really appreciated the opportunity to mentor a new graduate student. So, at this point, what we wanted to do, can someone tell me how much time is left? Okay, the Cindy minutes took over, I think. There were some Gary minutes up there too, yeah. Okay, the Cindy and Gary minutes are going to ask you to sit just for a moment and make a connection to Gary's challenges. Maybe some of what the graduate students saw for pushing forward boundaries could be there. Maybe some of the challenges that you recognize, that you thought about for your own personal journey, are ones that you recognize here. Maybe some of the strategies can be useful for the graduate students. The students asked us to inspire change agents, and if we inspired you, hopefully we have made you more curious, more prepared, more likely to use something in the future, more confident, increase your sense of what's capable to accomplish. Hopefully you can answer these questions silently. And then I'd like to wrap it up with another anecdote. We used to vacation in North Carolina at the beach, and the summer of 1999 we were on vacation at the beach, and I was stringing up some netting on the side of a deck with some cable ties so my toddler wouldn't fall off the edge. And Abby, my older daughter, picked up one of the cable ties that I was using, and she pointed it to me and she said, "This is a magic wand." And I said, all the stress is leaving me and I am calm. And she said, "No, you are a frog." Oh no, issues of identity again. So, remember Kermit, right? Okay, it's not easy being a frog. It's not easy being green. But what I wanted to say was that it's really fabulous that we've got all these frogs here. We all have the common experience that it's not easy being green, but coming back year and year to hop around in the pond with our colleagues is really very meaningful. And at the risk of pushing a pond metaphor too far, I actually wanted to end with the words of Robert Kennedy again, and to say that us oldsters don't need to worry about anything, because the next generation coming along has it together and is really going to push the boundaries. So, in Robert Kennedy's words, few will have the greatness to bend history itself, but each of us can work to change a small portion of events, and in the total of all these acts will be written the history of this generation. And I think that you all need to congratulate yourselves, because you've really taken difficult paths, and we've all come here to really meet each other and help us each push each other along the path a little bit more. Gary and I thank you.